Welcome to a confession that history tried to bury in silence. A voice recorded not in triumph, but in defeat. It came from a man whose medals had lost their shine, whose command had vanished beneath snow and steel. He sat in a dim interrogation room, wrists trembling, eyes hollow yet still proud. Outside, the war thundered its final chords, but inside that room another war was ending, the war within. He took a slow breath and said, "We did not surrender because we were weak. We surrendered because we finally understood." And then he paused, as if the weight of what he had seen could no longer be carried alone. March 1945. The Rhine Valley was a graveyard of machines. Engines smoked, bridges burned, and the sky, once the kingdom of the Luftwaffe, was now owned by the droning wings of American bombers. Every dawn sounded the same note, metal grinding against frost boots, crunching through mud, the distant thunder of factories thousands of miles away. The German front had become a corridor of exhaustion. Men marched not toward victory, but toward realization. Inside that interrogation cell, the American officer didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a stack of photographs on the table, rows of tanks lined up like fields of iron corn convoys stretching beyond the horizon. Smokestacks belching more power than any artillery could ever deliver. The German general stared at them for a long moment, then laughed once bitterly. "That's how we lost," he said quietly. "Not by men, by machines." He leaned back, hands open, as if finally surrendering to a truth larger than himself. The microphone on the table crackled softly. The pen of the interrogator paused. Outside, snow fell in the yard of the POW camp, melting on the helmets of guards who didn't yet know the war was over. The camera of memory pulls back slowly, revealing a nation built on steel meeting one built on will. And the moment will was no longer enough. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is on your clock right now. Because this story is about time, how it runs out for empires, how it lingers for truth. If you're hearing this in the quiet of night, somewhere between history and echo, then you're listening exactly where he was sitting that day, between defeat and understanding. The war was ending, but its confessions were just beginning. And among them, this one would stand apart, spoken, not to justify, but to admit. He was a soldier of a fallen empire, and his words would travel further than any bullet he ever fired. This is his story, the moment when pride surrendered to power. March 1945. The last winter of the war dragged its frozen shadow across Europe. The Rhine River, once the proud artery of a continent, now groaned under the weight of ruins. Bridges lay twisted like ribs of some dying beast. Cities burned through the fog, their fires flickering like tired hearts that refused to stop beating. The smell of diesel and damp stone filled the air, a perfume of exhaustion and inevitability. From the east came the thunder of the Red Army, unstoppable, unmerciful, rolling toward Berlin like an avalanche of vengeance. From the west, American convoys painted endless lines of movement headlights, shimmering against the wet asphalt of conquered roads. The air itself trembled, not from artillery alone, but from the hum of production that never slept. Detroit's engines still roared even here. Pittsburgh's furnaces breathed across the ocean. Every shell that landed on German soil was a syllable in a language of industry. In the shattered forests of the Ardennes, the snow carried more than footprints. It carried the echo of a failed counterattack, a last gamble that cost Germany what little it had left. Burned-out panzer hulls dotted the landscape like tombstones. Soldiers scavenged for warmth, tearing fabric from the dead, whispering prayers to a God who no longer answered in German. Their commanders spoke of regrouping, but no one believed in regrouping anymore. The general we follow, his name blurred in the archive, his signature half smudged by time, had once commanded thousands. Now he commanded silence. His division, once armored and unstoppable, was reduced to a handful of weary men trudging through mud toward American lines, rifles slung backward, flags improvised from surrender cloth. Behind them, artillery still boomed, not to defend, but to disguise retreat. The camera drifts over the battlefield. Black smoke coils upward, merging with low clouds. Somewhere a church bell tolls not for victory, but for endurance. Inside the ruins of Cologne, civilians huddle in basements lit by candles, the wax melted into shapes of fear. Children count seconds between bomb blasts, 1, 2, 3, and flinch when the rhythm breaks. Outside, tanks grind over cobblestones that once led to bakeries and bookshops. The sound of steel on stone becomes the new heartbeat of a dying empire. Across the channel, in offices lined with maps and ticking clocks, the Allies speak in metrics, tons of fuel miles, advanced sorties flown per day. War, once an affair of glory, has become arithmetic. Somewhere in Washington, a secretary types a report, current output 1 B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The keys click like gunfire. In contrast, Germany's factories choke on dust and rubble. Oil fields are gone, trains halted, synthetic fuel plants reduced to craters. What remains of production survives only in the fever of propaganda. The general knew this. He had read the final reports from Albert Speer's ministry numbers disguised as hope. Output remains sufficient, they claimed. But every figure hid a wound. Without oil tanks became bunkers. Without transport divisions became islands. And without faith orders became noise. The myth of invincibility, that sacred fire that once burned in the speeches of Nuremberg, was now ash carried by the wind. Night fell differently in those days. Longer, heavier, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. The generals spoke in whispers, fearing the walls had ears not of spies, but of history. For even they could feel it now, the inevitability of collapse. They looked east and saw a red horizon. They looked west and saw smoke rising from their own machines. Between these two ends of the world, they stood not as conquerors, but as witnesses to their own undoing. Somewhere near Remagen, the impossible happened. The Ludendorff Bridge, one of the last crossings over the Rhine, remained standing after days of bombardment. American engineers seized it within hours. The sound that followed was not cheers, but disbelief. German officers stared at the photographs with hollow eyes. The enemy had crossed the uncrossable. What followed was not strategy. It was resignation dressed as resistance. Orders to destroy the bridge came too late. Explosives failed. The river that once protected them became a road leading straight to their heart. The general was there when the telegram reached headquarters. He read it once, twice, and said nothing. His aide, a boy of 19, asked quietly, "What does it mean, sir?" The general simply replied, "It means we are out of time." Then he folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, as if to hide the sentence of a nation. By dawn, American armor rolled through villages where the only defenders were old men and boys in mismatched uniforms. Church bells rang again, this time not from command, but from instinct. They rang because they always had, because someone believed that sound could still mean life. The general watched from a hillside as his homeland folded into smoke. He no longer saw enemies, only inevitability. Somewhere in his mind, he remembered the factories of Essen, the pounding of hammers, the fire of furnaces that had once promised eternity. He remembered how proud they had been, how convinced that discipline could outlast abundance. But the truth was colder. No army, however brave, can fight hunger, exhaustion, and empty fuel tanks. He saw with painful clarity that the war had been lost, not in the trenches, But in the blueprints in the assembly lines, they never built fast enough. The camera drifts again from his face to the endless horizon of smoke and snow. The narration lowers to a whisper, the silence before surrender. And somewhere beyond the front, in the hum of American factories, in the rhythm of machines that never slept, the future was already being forged. It wasn't heroism that shaped it, it was capacity. Every rivet, every engine block, every plane rolling off a line in California or Kansas City was a weapon far deadlier than any gun. And when those machines crossed the ocean, they didn't just defeat an army, they buried an idea. The general didn't know, perhaps couldn't know, that his words in that interrogation room would echo for generations. But in that winter before the microphones and questions before the confessions, he had already understood what most men could not admit, that the age of courage alone was over. He stared once more at the horizon where the river glittered under fading light, and whispered something no one recorded. The wind took it. The snow covered it. But history somehow heard it. The truth was never just in the smoke. It was in the numbers hidden beneath it. Long before the general's confession, before his voice trembled through the microphone in that dim interrogation room, the war had already been decided not by courage, not by genius, but by arithmetic. The world's most disciplined army had been defeated by something it could neither see nor bomb: a production line. By 1944, American factories no longer slept. The nights of the Midwest glowed with fire, steel, coal, sweat, rhythm. Women with scarves tied around their hair hammered bolts into tank hulls, sparks dancing across their faces like fireflies. Trains screamed through the darkness, loaded with crates marked "Ordnance Urgent." On every dock, cranes groaned as Liberty ships rose from the water like steel islands, one completed every 3 days, one armed convoy every sunrise. The war was not only being fought, it was being manufactured. In Detroit, the Ford River Rouge plant transformed from a car factory into a battlefield of production. Every 63 minutes, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line, a machine built to erase a city. The men and women inside never heard the gunfire overseas, but their wrenches echoed louder than artillery. Across the Pacific in California, shipyards worked through blackout nights, thousands of workers welding under floodlights that turned night into imitation day. Their shadows moved like soldiers marching, synchronized, relentless. It wasn't heroism that changed the tide, it was capacity. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Germany's own heart was being carved out by the bombs of the RAF and the USAF. The Ruhr, once the empire's furnace, now flickered like dying coals. Entire factories melted under incendiaries. The smell of burning rubber replaced the smell of iron. Trains no longer ran on time because there were no trains left to run. Fuel had become rarer than hope. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, could barely lift 200 aircraft into the air, while the Americans sent 10,000. Pilots were boys, now faces too young to shave, eyes too old to dream. Albert Speer wrote frantic reports to the Führer, carefully worded, beautifully formatted lies. He called them adjustments. Adjustments in supply and output in logistics. But they were adjustments of desperation. In truth, Germany's factories had become graves where machines went to die. Inside bunkers buried deep beneath Essen and Stuttgart, engineers worked by candlelight, their blueprints stained with oil and ash. They still believed in miracles, new jets, new rockets, new promises. But miracles do not run on empty tanks. Every day they designed weapons they could never afford to build. Every week they sent letters home that would never be read. And yet even now, the general tried to believe. He had once walked through the halls of Krupp and IG Farben, watching pistons rise like temples of precision. He believed that discipline itself was a weapon, that German will would outlast American waste. He was wrong. Because what America built was not waste, It was infinity. Across the ocean, steel did not sleep. The hum of production was a hymn factories, as cathedrals, workers as believers, machines as prayers. From these sanctuaries of labor came tanks, planes, guns, fuel enough to arm the entire world twice over. Even nature bowed to it. Coal mines fed furnaces without rest. Rivers turned black with oil and silver with reflection. The night itself seemed powered by ambition. The Allies had learned what the Axis never understood, that war was not won on the battlefield, it was won in the blueprint. A memorandum from the U.S. War Department, dated January 1945, summed it in one line. Our strength lies not in the soldier's arm, but in the nation's hands. Those hands, millions of them, moved as one. A mother riveting a plane wing, a teenager checking bolts on a tank tread, a miner pulling another cart of coal from the dark. None of them knew the general's name. None of them would ever meet the men their work would destroy. But every rivet, every gear, every barrel, all of it was aimed straight at him. And in Germany, the sound of silence grew louder. By March, the Reich's total oil reserves had dropped below 10,000 tons, barely enough for a single week of operations. Trains were cannibalized for their engines. Trucks were burned for fuel. Soldiers walked. Horses pulled tanks. The miracle of mechanization had turned back into the Middle Ages. The general read the reports and stared at the map, red arrows crawling closer from every direction. The lines that once marked conquest now looked like veins closing around a dying heart. Somewhere near Frankfurt, a military accountant wept while typing the latest numbers. He knew they would never add up again. It was no longer a war, it was a countdown. And across the Atlantic, factories were still singing. The sound was steady, endless, inhuman, the mechanical heartbeat of an empire that had learned how to turn metal into destiny. While Germany ran out of men, America ran out of places to store its machines. The warehouses were overflowing rows of tanks stretching beyond the frame of any camera. If one was lost, 5 more replaced it before dawn. A tank destroyed in Europe was reborn the same day in Ohio. The general would later say, his voice quieter than breath, "We were never outnumbered by soldiers. We were outnumbered by the idea that they could never stop building." The truth of that statement would haunt historians for decades. Even Hitler in his final conferences had begun to sense it. The walls lined with maps that no longer mattered. His speeches filled with words like miracle, wonder, weapon, destiny. But no miracle could compete with momentum. America's factories had become gods, and they did not believe in fate. One day the general received a captured American leaflet dropped by bomber over German lines. It showed a single image, a line of tanks stretching to the horizon, each tagged with a serial number, and the words, "Built this month." He stared at it for a long time. It wasn't propaganda. It was inventory. And for the first time he felt something no soldier should ever feel: admiration for his enemy. He would remember that feeling later. Sitting across from his interrogator, the photographs laid before him, the truth too heavy to deny. But back then, in the cold of March 1945, it was still just a whisper in the back of his mind, the whisper that said, "We cannot outfight forever what they can outbuild in a day." The Allied bombers still roared above, painting the night with fire. The ground still trembled with the shock of impact. But underneath all that thunder, underneath the endless noise of war, was the quiet rhythm of inevitability. The war wasn't ending because men were tired. It was ending because the machines had already decided. And as the general watched one last convoy of refugees cross a frozen road toward the west, old women pushing carts, children wrapped in blankets, soldiers walking without words, he realized something he would never again say aloud. The surrender had already begun. Not with signatures, not with flags, but with silence, the silence that falls when even pride runs out of breath. It always returns to faces, not maps, not numbers, faces. In every war there comes a moment when uniforms lose their meaning, when the mud hides rank, when the cold erases pride. March 1945 was that moment. The camera moves low across the snow-soaked road near Remagen, a slow pan of boots sinking deep breath, hanging like ghosts. Somewhere beyond the ridge, engines murmur not battle but movement, retreat, surrender, survival. A boy, no older than 19, walks beside the general. His name is Hans, or maybe it isn't. History never wrote it down. His rifle strap digs into his shoulder. The barrel points toward the ground. Each step leaves a print that fills instantly with meltwater. He hums something under his breath, a lullaby his mother sang before the sirens came. The general hears it and almost tells him to stop, but doesn't. In this silence, even a song sounds like mercy. They pass a column of American tanks idling on the edge of town, their crews watching without hatred, only fatigue. One soldier lights a cigarette, the flare reflecting in his eyes like a small, borrowed sunrise. The general glances at him, young, distant, clean-shaven, and feels an ache that has nothing to do with defeat. He whispers almost to himself, "Children, everywhere children." Inside the ruined houses of the village, civilians move like shadows. A woman with a red scarf hands bread through a window to a prisoner shivering against the wall. A child clutches a tin cup, waiting for water that never comes. Somewhere a church bell rings, cracked off key, but it rings. The general looks up. For a moment he thinks of the sound as confession. That night they rest in what was once a school. Desks overturned, chalk dust still clinging to the blackboard where someone months ago had written an equation, a line of numbers ending in nothing. Hans sits near the stove, feeding it bits of paper, old orders, torn maps, anything that will burn. Each flare of light reveals faces hollowed by hunger yet strangely calm. They are men waiting to become memory. Outside, snow falls again. The world seems to pause, breath held between heartbeat and history. The general steps out into the courtyard. He can hear the river beyond the trees, swollen with ice and wreckage. In the faint moonlight, he sees the bodies of horses half buried in snow, their harnesses glinting like metals. He kneels beside one, touches its frozen mane, and whispers, "We asked too much of all of you." Then he stands, straightens his coat, and looks east where the horizon glows red, not with dawn, but with cities burning. Across the river, an American field hospital hums with a different amount of noise. Scissors whispers morphine prayer. Nurses move between cots. The air smells of disinfectant and mud. A German prisoner lies beneath a blanket, eyes fluttering open. He tries to speak, but the nurse only says, "Don't move." He smiles faintly, not because he understands her words, but because of her tone. For the first time in years, someone has spoken to him without command. Back at the front, the general writes a note in his journal, a single sentence: "We fought until belief itself ran dry." He closes the book, knowing no one will read it. It is not for history, it is for forgiveness. Morning comes like a wound opening. The sky bleeds pale light over the ruins. An American loudspeaker crackles through the fog. "Lay down your arms, and you will be treated humanely." The words drift across the field like a strange lullaby. Hans looks to the general. The general nods once, the smallest gesture, the end of a world. One by one, rifles fall into the snow. The sound is soft, softer than breathing. They walk toward the bridge, hands above their heads, helmets hanging from belts. Some smile nervously, others stare straight ahead. On the other side, American soldiers wait with cigarettes and suspicion. The general stops, halfway, turns to glance back at the land he once swore to protect. The smoke from a burning village coils upward, twisting into the shape of a question mark. He whispers, "So, this is how a century ends." At the checkpoint, an American lieutenant raises a hand. "Move along," he says quietly. No shouting, no triumph, just weariness. A camera clicks one photograph to prove the moment happened. Later, historians will study it, measure it, caption it. German officers surrender near the Rhine. But the lens cannot capture the tremor in the general's hand, the taste of iron on his tongue, the thought that everything he believed in had turned to rust. That night in the prisoner compound, the men sit around barrels of fire. Someone finds an accordion with half its keys broken. They play anyway, a slow, fragile tune that floats above the wire. Across the camp, an American guard listens and doesn't interrupt. He thinks of home, of radio songs, of the smell of bread, of a girl waiting somewhere far from here. For a moment, both sides share the same silence. The general lies awake on his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling. The wind presses against the tent like a restless ghost. He hears distant laughter, young, uncertain human, and closes his eyes. Images flicker behind them, parades, speeches, banners, a world that once believed itself invincible. He wonders when that belief turned to madness, when loyalty became blindness, when duty became denial. He doesn't have an answer, only the cold. Before dawn, he rises. The guards nod as he steps outside. Snowflakes drift through the floodlight, glow landing on his uniform, tiny medals of surrender. In the east, the first light touches the barbed wire, turning it silver. He breathes out steam, rising, disappearing. For the first time, the air feels clean. He murmurs, "Perhaps this is what truth feels like, when it no longer needs victory." Far away in a farmhouse that still stands, a child wakes to the sound of silence. No bombs, no planes, no marching boots. She pulls aside the curtain and sees the sky clear for the first time in years. Her mother whispers, "It's over," though she doesn't quite believe it. The camera lingers on her face, the reflection of mourning in her eyes, and then fades back to the general standing motionless in the yard. He closes his eyes, and the scene slows. The wind stills, the world exhales. For one heartbeat, the war stops completely. Not with an explosion, not with a flag, but with understanding. And in that fragile pause between history and memory, between guilt and grace, the general finally feels the weight lift. He knows that tomorrow he will speak, that he will confess not just to his captors, but to the age itself. He will say that wars are not lost by armies, they are lost by illusions. The snow thickens. The river murmurs. Somewhere an engine starts steady, mechanical, eternal. The world begins to move again. But for that single moment, everything stands still. The confession did not begin with words. It began with numbers laid side by side, a mirror of imbalance so vast it could no longer be denied. Germany had entered the war believing in precision, the art of the perfect machine, the disciplined soldier, the orchestrated strike. America had entered it believing in volume, the belief that quantity, if pure enough, could become its own form of quality. Two ideologies, two worlds, destined to collide not on ideals but on output. In March 1945, the scales were no longer tipping, they had already broken. Germany built 1,347 Tiger tanks during the entire war. America rolled out 49,000 Shermans. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and raw material starvation, could send barely 300 operational aircraft into the air. The U.S. Army Air Forces by then were launching 10,000 missions a day. Every bridge destroyed was rebuilt within a week by Allied engineers. Every plane shot down was replaced before its ashes cooled. It was not warfare anymore, it was arithmetic on fire. The general had seen the reports. lines of figures typed neatly on thin paper. He would trace them with his finger, each number a ghost of something once promised. "We have courage," he had told his men. "But courage cannot fill an empty fuel tank. Discipline cannot forge a new engine block. Pride cannot replace steel." Each battle they fought was already pre-written by someone thousands of miles away, someone sitting in a factory office, surrounded by blueprints and conveyor belts that never stopped. Berlin's propaganda ministry still broadcast its optimism, miracle weapons, final victory, unbroken spirit. But even their voices began to tremble. Even Goebbels could not shout loud enough to drown the sound of collapse. Every week brought new contrasts. Where Germany lost 100 men, the Allies replaced 1,000. Where one city burned in the Reich, 10 new factories lit the American horizon. The math became moral, the imbalance turned spiritual. For the soldiers at the front, it no longer felt like fighting. It felt like drowning. Reports came in of columns retreating, not because they had been defeated, but because they had simply run out of existence. One division listed 400 men missing, but the supply trains behind it had never even left Bavaria. Another was ordered to hold a bridge that no longer existed. The maps were lies printed on the skin of smoke. The general watched as the American tide rose higher every day, a tide not of men, but of machines. Trucks, tanks, cranes, bulldozers, pontoon bridges, all moving as if the earth itself had joined the invasion. He could feel the rhythm of it, the pulse of a civilization that had mastered the one weapon he could never command: abundance. The Allies had turned logistics into strategy. They fought not for territory, but for continuity. Every gallon of fuel, every ton of steel, every crate of ammunition had a destination, and that destination was forward. The German army fought bravely, even brilliantly, but it fought within a shrinking circle. Every time they turned, the circle tightened until there was nowhere left to turn but inward. Contrast became revelation. In early April, Allied air reconnaissance photographed the Ruhr Valley from 40,000 feet. Once the beating heart of Germany's industry, it now looked like a single wound: black craters, white ash, skeletal cranes standing like gravestones. In Washington, the photographs were studied with quiet awe. One American official wrote in the margin, "They have been erased by their own shadow." The numbers continued to flow, precise, indifferent, biblical. America's wartime output had exceeded $100 billion, more than the combined gross national product of the Axis powers. Germany's GDP, once vast and proud, had fallen below that of Canada. The Reich was now a paper empire existing only in rhetoric. Its machines, its myths, its messiahs, all reduced to noise beneath the steady heartbeat of industrial war. The general remembered the briefings in 1939, the pride with which officers had spoken of total war. Factories were to become barracks. Workers were to become soldiers of labor. It sounded invincible then. But total war demanded total supply, and there was nothing left to supply. The dream had devoured itself. Meanwhile, in the American Midwest, an assembly line foreman leaned over a clipboard and said to a reporter, "We're not fighting a war. We're building it." His words, printed in the Detroit Free Press, reached even London, and from there filtered into the intelligence summaries on Speer's desk. The general read it once, twice, and set the paper down. There was no malice in the man's words, only certainty. That was what frightened him most. Every statistic became a sermon, every comparison a confession. One Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours to produce the Sherman fewer than 50,000. Germany's precision had become its prison. The general once believed perfection was victory. Now he saw that perfection was delay. The enemy's machines were simpler, cruder, but they multiplied like insects. For every Tiger that roared, 10 Shermans replied. The battlefield had become a factory floor. Whoever could replace faster survived longer. In his field notes later recovered from a prisoner camp, the general wrote, "They fought with noise. We fought with silence. They had music in their engines, we had echoes in ours." It was not poetry, it was diagnosis. Albert Speer, writing years later, from his cell in Spandau, echoed that same clarity. We underestimated the momentum of democracy. We mistook noise for chaos, but it was harmony, the rhythm of a society at work. By then, the war had become a contest of persistence, not philosophy, and persistence does not surrender. As spring turned to ash, the contrast reached its final symmetry, a nation of rubble facing a nation of reserves. The Allies still had fuel to burn. Germany was burning furniture. The Allies dropped bombs by the hour. Germany counted every bullet. The Allies measured victory in tons. Germany measured survival in seconds. And yet, through all the imbalance, through all the humiliation, the general found a strange kind of peace. In the face of such scale, pride was pointless. The war had grown too large for men to own it anymore. It was now a force of nature, a storm powered by engines and equations. He felt no hatred toward the Americans, only awe. They had built a kind of weapon the world had never known: organization. He would later describe it to his interrogator as a machine that fed itself. And in his voice there was neither bitterness nor admiration, only exhaustion. He said, "We built soldiers. They built systems. We were trained to fight. They were trained to continue." In that sentence lived the entire century. For centuries, wars had been won by valor, by cunning, by the will of kings. But this war, this monstrous modern symphony, had been won by rhythm, production, persistence. The general knew that the age of glory had ended on the same day the first American factory lit its night shift. By May 1945, when the surrender papers were finally drawn, the contrast had already burned itself into the soil. The Allies stood surrounded by abundant crates of ammunition stacked higher than rooftops. Food rations for months. Vehicles lined up like dominoes awaiting purpose. Germany stood surrounded by memory ruins, hunger, silence. The distance between them was no longer measurable in miles, but in machines. The war's outcome was not a surprise, it was a statistic. The confession was not about guilt, it was about gravity. And as he looked across the table at the man recording his words, the general realized that history would remember this not as defeat, but as transformation. Because when pride surrendered, something else took its place: understanding. The camera fades into a small interrogation room. A single chair, a table, a lamp that hums faintly as it swings in the air. Shadows ripple across the canvas walls like memories refusing to die. The rain outside falls in steady rhythm, not violent, but endless, the kind that seeps into everything, even the soul. And there in the center of that hollow light sits a man who once commanded thousands. His hair is gray now, his uniform unbuttoned at the throat, his eyes still sharp but softened by the kind of pain that no bullet can cause. He doesn't look like a prisoner, he looks like a man who has outlived his own prophecy. The air smells of paper-wet boots and something faintly metallic, maybe ink, maybe regret. He speaks softly at first, almost afraid of the sound of his own voice. Words rolling out like smoke curling from the edge of something burning. "We thought we could outlast you," he says. "We believed discipline could replace abundance. That will could replace fuel." He looks down at his hands, tracing the veins like they are lines on a fading map. But there are things that even faith cannot feed. The interrogator, a young American no older than 30, doesn't interrupt. He just listens, eyes steady pencil, unmoving, as if afraid that the act of writing might break the silence that makes the confession real. The general's voice grows steadier. almost calm, like someone describing a storm that has already passed through him. You, Americans, you never stopped. Even when you bled, your factories kept breathing. Even when your soldiers fell, your machines stood up in their place. You learned something we never understood, that the machine is not the enemy of man, it is his mirror. We built soldiers, you built systems. We tried to conquer the world with precision. You conquered it with persistence. His words linger, heavy, patient. The sound of rain fills the spaces between them, a punctuation only nature knows how to write. He leans back, his chair creaking like an old memory. Outside, thunder murmurs across the valley, soft, exhausted. The lamp flickers once, twice. He doesn't notice. We lost this war long before we surrendered, he continues. We lost it the day we believed perfection mattered more than momentum. You built faster than we could bury. You replaced what we worshipped. Every factory you had was a weapon we could not reach. He pauses, his gaze drifting toward the rain-streaked flap of the tent. When I saw the Rhine burn, I knew it wasn't just an army crossing the river. It was an idea, one that couldn't be bombed. For a moment, the camera lingers on his face, the wrinkles etched deep like trenches across a landscape of guilt. His eyes are clear but distant, as if he's speaking not to his interrogator, but to the ghosts that follow him. You must understand, he says, his tone lowering. We didn't surrender because we were cowards. We surrendered because we finally understood what power meant. He looks up, meeting the officer's eyes, two soldiers separated by fate, joined by exhaustion. Power isn't bravery. It's continuity. It's not the strength to fight. It's the strength to continue. His breath catches, and we couldn't continue anymore. The tape recorder clicks softly, the reel turning, capturing every vibration, every pause, every breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once and is silent. The camera shifts closer, the general's hands clasped together. Knuckles, white wedding ring still on his finger. He rubs it slowly, a habit he doesn't realize he's doing. When I was a young officer, he says, I thought war was proof of man's greatness. I thought struggle purified us. But this war, this one stripped us down to the bone. It showed us that greatness and madness are twins. The rain grows louder now, the steady drumming like an orchestra tuning for the finale. He looks toward the sound, nodding faintly. I suppose this is what defeat sounds like. Peaceful. The interrogator finally asks, barely above a whisper. What would you tell the men who still believe it was worth it? The general closes his eyes for a moment. Exhaling slowly, his shoulders rising and falling, like waves breaking on a tired shore. I would tell them, he says, that victory built on illusion is no victory at all. I would tell them that the future belongs to those who learn before they lose. He leans forward, elbows on the table. We built monuments to pride, and you built assembly lines. Tell me which one still stands. Silence again. Not empty full. The kind that has weight. The kind that stays even after words are gone. He stands slowly, joints creaking, his shadow stretching long against the wall. He looks like a monument now, but a monument to understanding, not triumph. We surrendered to something larger than armies, he murmurs half to himself. We surrendered to a civilization that had learned to make creation its weapon. Then, almost gently, he adds, and perhaps, that is what the world will remember. The light above flickers again, once, and holds. The sound of the reel spinning fades, replaced by the rhythm of the rain. The camera pulls back as his voice lowers into something like prayer. If war is a fire, he says, then factories are the wind. We thought we could fight the wind. He stops, breathes. We were wrong. The film shifts weeks later. A train moves through the French countryside. The general sits by the window, wrists bound, but posture straight, staring out, as fields rush past, gold, gray, green. He watches children wave at the train, smiles faintly, and nods. No hatred, just distance. The narration returns. He was a man divided between the soldier he was and the witness he had become. He had seen the century turn, and in its turning, he had seen the death of valor. His reflection in the window blurs with the passing landscape, two images merging, one fading, one beginning. In another part of the world, the same factories that once built bombers now pour steel into bridges, tractors, and cranes. The noise of war has become the noise of rebuilding. The narrator continues. The war had ended, but the machine had not. It had simply changed purpose from destruction to creation, and in that transformation lived the echo of his confession. The sound design softens. We hear hammers, distant laughter, the faint hum of engines no longer meant to kill. The scene dissolves again, a newspaper headline, Europe rebuilds. A photograph of workers atop a scaffold waving at the camera. The narrator whispers, history rarely remembers who understood, only who survived. But somewhere in a box marked confidential, his words were waiting, a voice from the ashes, reminding the living what it cost to learn progress. Years pass. The general grows older, thinner. He spends his days tending a garden behind the small apartment the French government allows him. He doesn't speak much now. Sometimes he hums an old march, softly, almost tenderly, as if to forgive the past. One afternoon, a reporter asks if he regrets surrendering. He looks up from the soil, wiping dirt from his hands, and says quietly, "No. I regret not understanding sooner." Then he smiles, the first real smile in the entire film, and adds, "Machines never tire. But men need peace." The final scene fades back to that interrogation room, empty, now dust floating in the light. The chair still stands where he left it. On the wall, a faint stain marks where the lamp once hung. The reel is silent. The film grain flickers softly. The narrator speaks one last time. He surrendered not to defeat, but to understanding. And perhaps that is the only kind of surrender that endures the moment when pride finally kneels before truth. Outside, the rain has stopped. The Rhine glimmers under the morning light. The wind carries the hum of distant factories, steady, eternal, human. The camera rises, climbs above the camp, above the river, above the continent, still learning how to breathe again. Until all that remains is the sound, the quiet, patient sound of a world that has finally understood what it means to build. The screen fades from gray to pale blue. Morning light drifts over the ruins of Europe like a slow confession. The cities still smoke, but the air is different now. It no longer smells of ash. It smells of metal, cooling, of something ending. A single voice begins, low measured, full of fatigue and awe, the narrator, as if reading from the diary of the earth itself. Some battles end with gunfire, others with silence. This one ended with understanding. The camera sweeps across the Rhine, its waters glinting faintly, where the sunlight touches the wreckage of a bridge. Birds circle above the steel arches that once divided life and death. Their wings carve thin lines through the fog lines that look almost like forgiveness. The general's chair remains empty now, but his voice lingers, a phantom echo in the reel, repeating somewhere beyond hearing. We thought we could fight the wind. We were wrong. History rolls forward anyway. Machines roar again, not in anger but in rhythm, rebuilding, resurrecting. The same hands that once forged shells now shape girders, engines, and the bones of new cities. Children laugh in the skeletons of factories. A woman hangs laundry from a broken window, and the fabric ripples like a flag of peace no one announced. The camera glides through this rebirth, cranes swinging over rivers, trains rolling across repaired tracks, men in overalls smiling with grease still on their cheeks. Progress hums like a heartbeat. But the narration does not celebrate it, whispers. They say the war ended in 1945. But wars like this never really end. They change uniform, they change language. The battle for control becomes the race for production, for invention, for speed. The machine remains the only undefeated empire. The image shifts gears, spinning pistons rising and falling, the pulse of a new century being born from the wreckage of the last. Each movement is beautiful and terrible, at once creation and warning intertwined. Cut to the general's garden years later. The camera moves slowly behind him as he bends to prune a rose bush. His hands tremble slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. He hums a melody that sounds half military, half lullaby. Around him the world has moved on, children run past the fence chasing a wooden hoop. The streetcar rattles by, carrying workers in clean coats. The voiceover returns soft as breath. He lived quietly, the man who once commanded thunder tending flowers instead of armies. And perhaps that was his truest victory. The lens catches his profile washed in sunset light. For a moment, the glint in his eyes could be sorrow or peace. Then, an image of a new generation. The camera pans across classrooms in America and Germany, alike young faces staring at maps of a world their grandparents destroyed and rebuilt. Teachers' voices echo, history is not a story of winners, it is a story of warning. The narrator continues. Every student who reads those lines inherits a fragment of that confession, not the guilt, but the knowledge, the understanding that pride can build and pride can burn. Outside the window, the factory whistles blow again, the sound now ordinary, harmless, even hopeful. The film slows. The screen darkens to archival black and white. Over it, the general's real voice returns old, crackling, distant. If there is one thing I would tell the next century, it is this: never confuse motion with meaning. We built faster than we thought, we destroyed faster than we understood. Learn before you build. Think before you march. The words fade, but the tone remains echoing like wind through corridors of steel. The closing montage unfolds like memory dissolving into dream, the burned-out tanks now overgrown with grass. The broken statues covered in moss. A child dropping a toy airplane into a puddle. The reflection rippling into the shape of a bomber, then fading into clouds. The narrator speaks softly, the cadence of final breath. Some truths are learned only when the noise stops. Some victories are written in silence. A distant bell rings, not for morning, but for beginning. The music rises, slow strings, faint piano, neither sad nor triumphant, just steady. The final images merge the Rhine, gleaming like a scar across the continent, a factory chimney releasing white smoke instead of black, and the general's chair, still empty, still waiting, lit by the morning sun. The last line arrives like a whisper, half to the audience, half to history itself. Every age has its confession. This was ours. The rest will be yours. The screen fades to white. The reel clicks, and the echo continues.